Welcome to our next lecture in elementary statistics at Dallas College. We are starting chapter 2 with section 2.1, graphical summaries of qualitative data. As usual, I have the objectives here that we're going to cover in the slide or in this lecture, but I am not going to walk through them. If you want to stop, these could be headings for your notes or whatnot. First thing we're looking at is something called frequency distribution. And so what we're trying to do is display our collected results in forms that help us interpret those results more easily. The majority of humans are very visually adept, and so one of the most powerful tools in mathematics has been the Cartesian system that you know as the XY graph. Most of us are exposed to a lot of graphs and charts as we go through life, if we look at newspapers, etc. And because we're exposed to them, we can interpret them. Because the numerical data is put into a visual form, we can often interpret what is happening around the data and identify patterns, which, a lot of math is about identifying patterns. So for example, if we saw a bar graph going up and it represented the revenue for a company, we might say the company is doing well because each bar is getting increasingly larger. If that same graph for revenue was going down, we might say, oh, this company is not doing so well. And we might be able to say that in an instant without even recognizing what the amounts were, etc. Okay? So using charts and graphs can really help us interpret the results of our study and help us answer the questions that we started the study for. A frequency distribution is simply a graph or a table that represents the frequency of selection for each category. So the frequency of a category is the number of time it occurs in a data set. And what does that mean? We're going to look at an example that'll help. But, maybe you have a survey and you ask people, are they Democrat or Republican or independent? So let's say you asked 100 people and 33 selected Democrat. Well, then the frequency of Democrat would be 33. The frequency distribution would be the table of all those three responses, Democrat, Republican, and independent, and the number of people that responded in each category. And possibly you might have a fourth category, no response. Here we have a frequency distribution of a retailer who accepts 4 different types of credit cards, and they list the type of credit card used by the last 50 customers. And so here we have a frequency distribution. It's just a list of all the selections made by those last 50 customers. The frequency distribution table here represents the frequencies for each type of credit card. All we did is go back to the table, count the number of MasterCards used, the number of Visas used, which was 23, American Express and Discover. So you can see all of those here. One of the things that we might do to manipulate this data mathematically is to calculate a relative frequency, which you might think of in terms of a percent. Okay? A frequency distribution displays how many observations are in each category. Often we are interested in the proportion of observations in each category. How many percent, which is really what a proportion represents, how many percent responded Democrat or Republican, etc. The proportion of observation in a category is called the relative frequency of the category. The relative frequency of a category is the frequency of the category divided by the sum of all frequencies. And you can see this formula here. This is just basically an average or a percent, if you would. To construct the relative frequency distribution for the credit card data, we begin by summing the frequencies. And we see that there were 50 people identified, or 50 choices made, which is what we got in the original problem, right? They recorded the credit cards used by the last 50 customers. Next, we compute the relative frequency by taking the frequency divided by the total number of observations. And there you can see the relative frequency in the table with the entry to the right. And so again, you can think of these that 22% used MasterCard, 0.46 or 46% used Visa, 18% American Express, and 14% used Discover. So relative frequencies are just an idea of an average, or maybe better than an average would be calling it a percent. Okay. Here again, we have another example. This is a good one for you to do. It'll take a little time, so go ahead and go through. Actually, this won't take that long because it's only asking you for one. But go through and see if you can calculate the frequency and the relative frequency of the category single, talking about the types of aircraft. Hit pause and then continue on. Again, I'm not going to walk through this. Bar graphs are a graphical representation of a frequency distribution. This is our first bar graph. It consists of rectangles of equal width, each rectangle being a bar, with one rectangle for each category. The heights of the rectangles represent the frequencies, and that's what we have in the graph on the left, or they can represent the relative frequencies, and that's the graph on the right in purple. And so you can see both the visual displays of the frequency and the percentage. And you can see that they are relatively proportional, meaning that the Visa, the actual number of Visa, is the tallest bar, as is the relative frequency of Visa, which actually makes sense when you think, okay, well, the largest grouping would also be the largest percentage or relative frequency. A Pareto chart is a bar graph presented in order of frequency or relative frequency. So this is just ordering it from largest to smallest. Sometimes we do it from smallest to largest. It depends upon what you're asking and how that really communicates outcomes better to you. This one, it says that these charts are useful when it's important to see clearly which are the most frequently occurring categories, and possibly this is even more important if the numbers are closer together. You can also do horizontal bars, but these are, I don't know, but I think they're, I mean, you can still see that, well, this is a different chart, excuse me, but I think we're more used to vertical bars. It's, for some reason, I feel like it's easier for me to see. I mean, I can still see, in this case, managerial, professional, and technical employment is the largest group. But, and the reason they're talking about using the horizontal bars is if your categories have longer names, then it's easier to put them in, versus you can imagine like the skinny vertical bars. Side-by-side bar graphs. Sometimes we want to compare two bar graphs that have the same categories, especially like if you're, like, let's say we're looking at men versus women. We're looking at, in this case, the chart at the bottom, the bar graph at the bottom, we're looking at 2 different years. So it's really nice to see all the categories in different years. I see a lot of reports like this at school, especially around enrollment. What was the enrollment for spring 2025 compared to spring 2024, etc.? A pie chart is an alternative to a bar graph for displaying relative frequency information. I think you guys all know this probably. A pie chart is a circle which is divided into sectors, and the relative sizes of the sectors match the relative frequencies of the category. Again, when we're talking about relative frequencies, we can think of these numbers as percents. And so if your percent is your relative frequency is 0.25, that means 25% of the respondents answered that category. And so you'd have 25% or a quarter of the pie would be represented by that category. Here is an example of a pie chart for the credit card use. And we can see that Visa, which was the largest card used, had a relative frequency of 0.46, which is just below half of the circle, or just below 50%. Okay, I do agree that I think it's always best, especially in a statistical study or experiment, that not only if you're using a pie chart, that you include the actual percentage numbers in the label on the chart. It's just more accurate and more informative. Again, here we have a number of questions regarding a study or a survey that was conducted before. Why don't you go ahead and hit pause? There's 3 different questions it's asking you to do. Won't take long. And again, it helps you see if you've understood the material. So go ahead and hit pause, and I'm going to move on. Finally, we have the summary of information that you need to know for this section. And you can hit pause again if you want to check your notes and make sure you have all of those. But this one is, a lot of people will have this as prior knowledge just by general exposure to news and information and media.